When you look at a Formula 1 car from the front, you'll notice that the wing bends downwards towards the ground on the outer edges, whilst the centre is much higher from the ground, with the exception of a tiny bit in the very centre that drops down. Why not just have the wings straight like they used to be? After all, tilting the wings down like this means that some of the airflow is going to be pushing the wings sideways in towards the centre of the car rather than pushing it down, so this is inefficient. I'll be explaining all of that and more tricks that have been used on F1 front wings for this video. What was Renault's 20 element front wing for? Why does this car not even have a front wing? So, what does a front wing do? Well, that seems quite obvious, right? The front wing makes downforce, but it has a bigger role than this too. As it's the first part of the car that meets the airflow, its job also involves conditioning that airflow down the length of the car. And depending on the technical regulations and car philosophy, that role can be very different between different teams. In the history of Formula 1, there's two nose designs that are the most influential designs in the sport's history. The first one is the Lotus 49B, which was the first to feature a front wing. The second is the Tyrrell 019, the first high-nose F1 car. I've talked a lot about 1990's nose cone design on this channel, because I believe that the high nose was the last step in creating the shape of the modern Grand Prix car. In fact, high nose designs even made their way into the World Endurance Championship with the Audi R18 6 megajoule car. The Tyrrell 019 raised the centre of its nose to let the airflow underneath to the floor, raising the overall level of downforce. But when McLaren tried a high nose on their car, it wasn't as fast as they'd like, and they'd never raced the high nose test car. McLaren also raised their front wing height, but the further the front wing is from the ground, the less downforce it makes, so they lost a bunch of front wing effectiveness. Tyrrell, on the other hand, had their front wing sharply drop down to the road level with what became known as the anhedral front wing. The term comes from aeroplanes, where wings that slope downwards are called anhedral and an upward slope is called dihedral. But this Tyrrell anhedral wing didn't actually stick around for long. By 1993, the nose had dropped significantly, and by 1995, Tyrrell were running a low-mounted straight wing once again. The concept was good, but perhaps a little too far ahead of its time. In 1991, a year after Tyrrell's 019 was released, Benetton released the B191, and it featured a full-width straight wing with a nose mounted on pylons. This let the air pass under the nose, but still let the front wing be close to the ground. Both this design and the Tyrrell 019's design require a raised chassis bulkhead to maximise downforce. You compare this to the McLaren of the day, where the chassis bulkhead was tall and nearly met the floor, but after a long time as the meta, the FIA banned pylon wings from Formula 1 in 2022. F1 front wings had to then be attached directly to the nose cone like in 1989, but of course the teams understood raised noses very well by this point, so they didn't want to abandon the concept entirely. The rules required the noses to not be below a certain height. What the teams have done is quite interesting. They drop the nose to the level where it needs to be. Then they steeply raise the wing's height from the centre before gradually dropping it down towards the outer edges here. The anhedral angle is also steeper on the upper wing elements than the lower ones, making a wing that narrows down at the edges, but the front wing is also a lot higher off the ground than it was for the Tyrrell 019. This is because the 019 was a flat floor car and modern F1 cars are ground effect cars, so there's more downforce to be gained from lifting the front wing like this. It's anhedral rather than straight because you want to have a clear path for airflow to the floor's Venturi tunnels, but the front wing surface in front of the front wheels doesn't need to have this effect since the airflow just goes to the wheels and not to the floor. So by using an anhedral front wing, you can have the outer edges close to the ground where they make downforce, and the inner edges up high and out of the way of the floor. But there's even more going on than just clearing a space for airflow into the Venturi tunnels downstream. The upper elements are also crucial in getting air around those front tyres, which is why they have the steeper anhedral angle, as the gap between The upper front wing elements and the front wing end plate acts as a channel to push the air outwards of the front wheels, or the outwash effect that the FIA hates so much. But it's also interesting that teams have been moving away from the anhedral front wing concept. In 2022, front wing anhedral angles were often very noticeable, especially on the Aston Martin, but the lower front wing elements are now almost straight, but just not quite. The upper elements, on the other hand, have stayed with the anhedral design philosophy. The reason that teams are going for straight lower elements is likely efficiency. They're producing more downforce with the ground effect now, so the wings don't need to be worked as hard. This is just like the 1980s, when teams eventually ditched the front wing entirely as the ground effect was producing enough downforce on its own. And some cars were being structurally compromised by the levels of downforce produced in the early 80s because they were aluminium and not carbon fibre. But what about some of the other front wing tricks from the flat floor era? The early 2000s cars, for example, used dihedral wings. What's all that about? Well, this is the regulations again. The regs at the time allowed the middle of the front wing to be lower than its outer edges, so the teams used this to its maximum and lowered the middle of the front wing, keeping it close to the ground, and then the outer edges to meet the regulations. This is how F1 front wings will look next year as well, by the way, but more on that later. But what about the Renault 20 element front wing? What's going on here? There's so many bits and pieces. This is a result of 9 years of lunacy from the FIA, so let's go back to 2009. Unlike 2008's rules, where front wings were so narrow that it was completely impossible to ever have any sort of outwash concept, and the teams were forced to push tyre wake inboard, the full-width 2009 front wings allowed the teams to push some tyre wake outwards, but front wings remained simple since they were full width, so they could work quite well at pushing the air outwards. Then they made the wings slightly narrower in the worst aero regulation change in history, 2014. This was narrow, but it wasn't narrow enough to make the outwash impossible. So front wings got way more complicated as teams had to work harder to make outwash work, and the cars got harder to follow as a result. And for 2017, they made the cars faster and look cooler, but although they increased the front wing width, they kept it narrower than the newly wider front tyre and track width, which meant they had the same problem but now with more design freedom to make some even crazier contraptions. This peaked at the 2018 German Grand Prix when Renault brought out their 20 element front wing. All of these bits and pieces on the front wing are about pushing air outboard and around the front tyre so the car behind can deal with the wheel wake instead. For 2019, the FIA mandated simpler front wings that were full width once again. The teams would eventually settle on a mildly dihedral design to create the channel of air effect on the bottom surface that the current front wings produce on the top surface with the anhedral wings today. Next year, we'll go back to a 2008 style front wing, but with a bit of a twist. There will be the main portion of the front wing in the middle. This will be dihedral, being low in the middle where the floor makes a lot less downforce as there is no central Venturi tunnel, and it's also a step floor, and low bits can sometimes be too low to produce downforce effectively, whilst the outer edges of the floor where all the downforce is made will get clean air flow as the front wing rises away from the road to make a nice clear path. But then right at the inner edges of the front wheels, a massive front wing end plate pointing inboard to keep the tyre wake in. Then on the side of this end plate is a flattish element much lower to the ground than the rest of the wing, as a sort of frontal diffuser in front of the front wheels. These are some of my favourite front wing tricks, but what are yours? Leave your thoughts in the comments.